Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and this is my review of episode 7 of season 1 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and in my opinion it was a relatively weak episode and there are a lot of things in it which really reminds me of Star Trek Discovery in a bad way. All kinds of internal continuity problems which makes it illogical, all kinds of annoying characters and dialogue. Some of the way the dialogue is written, like in some scene Pike and Number One are remembering some kind of adventure they had in the past together, and that gives them an idea of what to do. That's exactly the kind of stuff as Michael and Book were constantly remember some past adventures they had together which we never got to see, and so we have the same kind of dialogue here. And we have a guest character who reminds me of Gray from Star Trek Discovery, probably the worst character of that entire show. And it's not just the way she looks or behaves, but some of her dialogue, like she starts talking with Spock and telling him you shouldn't choose one or the other when talking about Spock being half human and half Vulcan. She tells him you don't have to be one or the other, it doesn't have to be so binary and all of that, and I would much prefer to simply get some kind of exotic alien or something. You know, this is a science fiction show. I'm so tired of all these characters who come straight out of today's politics. Why not have some kind of alien creature or something? Have an alien show up with 5 different genders together or something. That would be fine. Like, I'm tired of seeing these humans who dress like today and who have these ghost fashion choices and they are non-binary and all of that, and mixing it with Spock was just kind of strange. And we have a bunch of scenes of Nurse Chapel retaking the ship like she's Bruce Willis. She's the one who goes through the tunnels on the ship and she puts everyone to sleep with a hypo spray, while Pike is stuck in prison and forced to do kitchen work because, you know, they showed early on in the season that Pike is really good at cooking, so Pike is constantly in the kitchen cooking for everyone while the women save the ship from the bad guys. And there are all the mentions of slavery being everywhere outside the Federation and how bad it is and all of that. It really reminds me of Star Trek Discovery, where they constantly told us that slavery is bad, as if it's some kind of revelation to know that. Like, it's very important to keep mentioning, you know, slavery, that's bad. Like, it's the only moral message they can push, like the most simplistic thing that is obvious anyway, so that's kind of boring to me. And the most annoying thing in the whole episode is that in the beginning they say that they go into an area outside of Federation space and it will take 2 days for a message to reach the Federation from where they are. They specifically say that in the beginning, even though they didn't have to, and yet later in the same episode the villain lady sends a message to Vulcan, to Spock's girlfriend, and they have a live conversation with her both ways, like instant communication with Vulcan. So did this show forget that Vulcan is part of the Federation again? Didn't they say in the beginning of the episode that it takes 2 days for a message to reach the Federation only in one way, and in the end of the episode they suddenly have two-way communications with live communications with Vulcan? So that kind of thing really pissed me off. It reminds me back when I was reviewing season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, I had a very long rant about the same kind of mistake when in one episode they said that they cannot contact Starfleet. They were being chased by Control, and Control took down the communication relays to Starfleet, something like that, and yet they could contact Ambassador Sarek, and then he showed up immediately at their location to have a chat with his daughter Michael, and then he went back into Vulcan and no one even bothered to mention to him, oh, by the way, can you contact Starfleet for us? Can you send a message to Starfleet? If your Vulcan ship is so much more advanced than all of Starfleet that you can pick up our signals and show up to our location in 1 second and be back in Vulcan the next day, so why don't you send the communication for us to Starfleet? No one even bothered to suggest that, and so they could talk with Sarek instantaneously and he could show up instantaneously without any problems, and yet they cannot contact the rest of the Federation, even though Vulcan is part of the Federation. So they do exactly the same kind of mistake in this episode when they say they cannot contact the Federation. It will take 2 days for a signal to get there, and yet they can have live conversation with the Pring, and she can show up there from Vulcan in an instant, and yet they cannot contact Starfleet. So that kind of writing really pisses me off. It takes me out of it. And all this soap opera with Spock's future wife is really starting to annoy me because, you know, I was fine with it for 1 episode, 2 episodes, but now I see it's going to be a reoccurring character every 2 episodes. You know, Spock was supposed to only be mating once every 7 years, and yet now he's doing it every 2nd episode with his future wife, which no one knew about in the time of TOS. When she showed up on screen in TOS, everyone was asking him, who is she? How come half the crew didn't know her already when she was used to show up on their ship constantly just a few years ago, and half of the crew are the same crew supposedly. So did they all get amnesia at some point? Was she classified just like Michael Burnham was, and that's why no one was allowed to talk about her? Like, nothing makes any sense if this is supposed to be a prequel to TOS and there is no continuity. And also, just judging this show by itself, it's not really that interesting. I'm not really interested in seeing these Vulcan soap opera stories of him constantly being with his wife and they're constantly struggling with their relationship, and all of that is boring to me, except when they used it for comedy, you know, the previous time when they body swapped and all of that. So if they use it for comedy, fine, then it can be like Bortus and Clyden in the Orville, something like that, which is comedic, I will be fine with. But so far, it's just boring most of the time and not that interesting, and makes no sense since half the crew should know her by the time of TOS, and yet no one knew who she was, including Nurse Chapel, who kisses Spock in front of her on the view screen in the end of the episode, and yet when she sees her in TOS, she's completely surprised by her existence when Spock says that's his wife. And Uhura even asked Spock, who is it? Maybe that's why Uhura wasn't in this episode, so that there wouldn't be a continuity mistake, because Uhura specifically asks Spock, who is that beautiful woman on the screen? So obviously she cannot meet her in the show, or if she does meet her, she needs to get amnesia at some point and forget all about it. So these kind of things annoy me. And the plot of the episode itself can be summarized in one sentence. Basically, pirates take over the ship and they have to get it back. And the pirates themselves look kind of ridiculous. Kind of reminds me of the TNG episode with those guys who were supposed to be cool, I guess, who were kind of like rebels of their society, and Picard tried to negotiate with them or something. And the leader of the pirates really reminds me of Taserface from Guardians of the Galaxy. He kind of behaves the same way, patting Pike on the cheek and threatening to eject all his crew from airlocks, just like Taserface actually did in that movie, I think. And this guy is also the ship's cook, and so his crew hates his cooking, and that's why Pike suggests that he will cook for them instead, so that the crew will like him, I guess, or something. Like, there are some attempts at comedy, but it doesn't really land that well, in my opinion. And there's one strong woman of color on that ship who is the only one who is good, the only one who objects to selling people to slavery, and in the end Pike tells her she should be the captain because she's such a strong woman who cares about her crew and all of that. So I keep wondering, why is it specifically her from all the crew who is like that? Is that again checking the boxes? And meanwhile, that non-binary lady on the Enterprise turns out to be a villain. Actually, she's the real leader of the pirates, and she takes over the Enterprise and becomes really obnoxious. So she's kind of poking fun at Spock for buying into her BS earlier and all of that kind of stuff. And then she contacts the T'Pring because her actual plan was not to capture the Enterprise. She just wants to get some specific Vulcan out of prison. And we see that Vulcan in the very end. That was something that kind of made me laugh, which I guess might be a good thing. It depends where they go with it. If they do something good with it later, maybe that will be great, but we'll wait and see. So anyway, Pike and Number One managed to persuade the good pirate lady and some of the crew to mutiny against Taserface. And meanwhile, on the Enterprise, Spock is beating up the bad guys and throwing them against the walls in an overly aggressive way, so he seems to be really violent and angry, which does not fit his character. You know, it reminds me of something that Nimoy said once, how he invented the nerve pinch as not to be so uncivilized as just to beat people up, so he invented all kinds of ways to do it more gently, and yet here we see Spock throwing people's faces into consoles and all of that, so that's kind of funny. And then to prevent the T'Pring from bringing the prisoner to that lady, he kisses Nurse Chapel in front of her, and so she doesn't release the prisoner. And meanwhile, Pike's ship attacks the Enterprise after disabling it with his code. So if he disabled it, why does he still need to attack it? I'm not sure. That's one of those internal continuity illogical things I mentioned. And then the villain lady beams herself out and leaves the rest of her crew behind on the Enterprise, and they all surrender. And it's funny how they're all dressed in rags and all of that, and it reminds me of those guys from TNG, and also the guys from Star Trek V who also took over the ship in that movie because they were working for Cyborg. But what doesn't make sense is that in that movie those guys were random civilians which Cyborg found and collected into his army. They were not said to have been working for him in the past. So it doesn't make sense to tie those guys to the guys we see in this episode, which in the end reveals to be all about Cyborg as well, because in the end of the episode, Spock tells us that the prisoner that lady wanted to release was his half-brother Cyborg, who is a Vulcan who rejected all logic and all of that, and then we actually see him and he does look very similar with the beard and the haircut and all of that, so I found it kind of funny that they're tying things into Star Trek 5, but it makes no sense. Why would the guys who were working to release him dress the same way as the guys he later recruited in Star Trek 5, who were not the same guys, because those were random civilians which he collected in the start of that movie. They were not people that he knew before. I am curious to see what they'll do with Cyborg, because I do think that character does have potential, but it's also a risk of creating the same kind of logical inconsistency of how come the Enterprise crew will not know who he was by the time of Star Trek 5. They all got amnesia and they all forgot all about it, even though some of the crew must have heard about him at least. Maybe they didn't physically meet him or see him, but at least they should have heard about it if they had adventures involving the same character in the past. And so it's the same problem as with the Bring, who everyone forgot about by the time of the OS, even though half of the crew saw her just a few years earlier. And so that's why I suspect it will not work in the end, but I am open-minded. I am curious to see what they'll try to do with that character, because I do think it has potential. Maybe it will be great, hopefully. And other things that annoyed me in the episode, there's a scene of the Enterprise flying through an asteroid field and colliding with all the asteroids and all of that. So once again, the deflector dish is not working, just like in Star Trek Discovery and in JJ Trek, when the ship always has to collide with everything because it looks cool. They don't care about the fact it doesn't make sense, and how come the deflector dish is not working and doing its job of deflecting things away from the ship. Instead, they just collide into everything all the time. And there's a scene of something that looks like the Tholian web appearing all around the ship, and I remember in the trailers people thought it's going to be the Tholians, and of course it's not. Once again, a disappointment. I remember in Star Trek Picard there was a trailer showing something that looked like the Tholian web in the sky, and people were coming up with theories saying, how will the Tholians be part of the plot? Are there Tholians in the past? And then it turns out to be just stupid drones that Dr. Zoom created that just happen to look like that. And in this episode we see something that looks like the Tholian web, but it's just some random lasers in an asteroid field, and it has nothing to do with the Tholians. So once again, a disappointment. Wouldn't it be cool to see a Tholian done right with good special effect, because those were actually exotic aliens who are made of crystals, who live in a lava-like environment? That wouldn't be right to show it in a science fiction show. It's much more important to show strong women and gothic non-binary characters who lecture everyone about their feelings and all of that. That's much more important than showing exotic aliens and all of that. So we have the scenes of the Enterprise smashing through all the asteroids, and for a moment they are delayed by those lasers, and they specifically say those are lasers, and that made me remember a scene from TNG when they were making fun of lasers, calling it primitive weapons that wouldn't even penetrate their navigational shields. And yet here we have lasers which endanger the whole ship, and then they get over it and no one mentions it again. So what was even the point of that, except for just a cool visual action scene without any actual purpose to the story? And then it's all about these pirates who are supposed to be funny. I guess there are some funny moments here and there, but overall it was all boring and pointless. And in the end of the episode, Pike is kind of doing an imitation of a sea pirate from Earth, which was kind of ridiculous, but at least that was kind of funny moment. And I don't mind the show being a little bit silly and comedic as long as it's actually funny. But very few things were actually funny to me in this episode, which I found mostly boring. So I would say this was a below average episode in my opinion. And the only thing I found interesting in it was the very end when they actually showed Cyborg. That did pique my interest because I am curious to see what they'll do with that character. So I guess we'll wait and see. So that's my opinion. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss all of this in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.